except for the Q&A session. So just to note, please, if you can, turn your cameras on. It's great to kind of see faces and speaking to faces rather than black kind of name badges. So if possible, if you could do that, it would be great. So I'm delighted to welcome our speaker today, Professor Alison Phipps. Alison is Professor of Sociology at Newcastle since 2021, and prior to that was Professor of Gender Studies at Sussex. Many of you will, I'm sure, have encountered Alison's feminist scholarship on sexual violence in universities, on the impossibilities of institutional transformation, and how feminist theory and activism are both entangled with and resist oppressive systems. You may also have come across her generosity and feminist ethics of care as both a teacher and a colleague. The author of countless articles and several books, including Me Not You, The Trouble with Mainstream Feminism, The Politics of the Body, and her forthcoming book, Personal Business, Sexual Violence in Racial Capitalism, what consistently animates Alison's work and her politics is a feminist desire for and commitment to collective work towards more liberatory futures without sexual violence. So Alison will be speaking today about the different ways that the different stories that aim to account for gender domination and sexual violence and what they offer our understandings of sexual violence. So thank you very much, Alison. Welcome. And if you do have questions, there'll be a Q&A session at the end. And if you want to write in the questions in the chat, please feel free to do so. I'll collect them at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, great. Thank you very much, Maria, for inviting me and for organising this, and to Liz for introducing me. It's so lovely to be introduced by somebody that I'm working so closely with and really enjoying working with. That's a real treat. So thank you very much, Liz, for agreeing to do that. I'm just going to try and share my screen again now. I'm sorry, I'm really rubbish at Teams. Window. Okay, can we see that?
We can see that, Alison, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, lovely. Perfect. So I also must apologise because I've got my glasses on so I can see my notes, but I can't really see any of you. So you're a nice blurry kind of mass of people at the moment. So I don't know, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's not, I'm not sure. But I will take my glasses off for the Q&A so I can see people properly. So I'll speak for about 45 minutes and then we'll have time for Q&A and discussion. Before I start, a content note. As you can already guess, this talk is about sexual violence. The content of the talk is also a little bit of a departure for me. It's from my next book, which, as Liz said, is called Personal Business, Sexual Violence in Racial Capitalism. And it's being published by Manchester University Press at a date at some point in the future when I've finished it. The book explores what sexual violence does in broader systems of domination. So it articulates patriarchy and racial capitalism as intersecting and mutually interdependent systems. So it's kind of not quite a dual systems theory and not quite a unified theory, but it's perhaps something in between. I'm not sure, I'll tell you when I get there. And the book also explores all of the different ways that sexual violence enters the world. So acts and threats of violence and imputations and punishment of violence. And it argues that all of these vectors of sexual violence co-act in systems of control. The book has 4 themes: enclosure, extraction, dispossession, and disposal. And this talk comes from the first chapter of the book, which travels back beyond the start of capitalism and explores different origin stories of sexual violence. And the reason I say it's a departure for me is that I'm not a historian. So I'm building on the important work of other people, including Gerda Lerner, Maria Mies, and more recent books by Angela Saini, David Graeber, and David Wengrow. I'm also writing backwards from Silvia Federici's work in some ways. I don't like to talk with slides, but I've made you something nice to look at so you don't have to look at me the whole time. And hopefully that will help to illuminate some of the things that I'm talking through. So Catherine McKinnon wrote in 1989 that feminism seemed like an epic indictment in search of a theory. And although there's a rich body of feminist literature on sexual violence, in many ways, McKinnon's statement still seems quite apt to this field. Sexual violence is heavily researched but remains under-theorised, apart from the work of some very brave and very clever people, including Tanya Sarissier, who's in the talk. Hi, Tanya. You must all look at her work if you haven't already. So we don't have that much theory around sexual violence currently. And what we do have, we kind of bring together often from disparate areas. However, searching for epic theory seems, in a kind of postmodern world, to be a bit fruitless and a bit naive. Sexual violence doesn't have an essence and it can't be reduced to a singular form. So that's why I've called this talk an anti-origin story rather than an origin story. Searching for origins is a natural human inclination. As Graeber and Wengrow write, it's often prompted by dismay at the state of the world. So we ask, were we always like that, or did something at some point go terribly wrong? We have creation myths in almost all cultures and religions, and whether we believe these literally or not, they help us to understand the world and to process the things that we can't accept. So they tell us why. Why does evil exist? Why is the world the way it is? Why does rape happen? These are loaded questions and they're asked on heavily politicised terrain. This is why bad origin stories are everywhere. And sexual violence is usually dealt with in ways that misunderstand its origins and end up perpetrating more violence. The definition of certain groups as inherently sexually violent is a key technology of power. Black men, Mexican men, immigrant men, trans women, and recently Palestinian men in the context of the genocide in Gaza. In this talk, I'll explore various different origin stories of sexual violence that treat it as primarily socio-biological, socio-cultural, socio-economic, or socio-political. And as I've said, I don't aim to choose between the stories or create an alternative one. Instead, I try to move from asking why did sexual violence emerge to what does sexual violence do and how do these different origin stories help us to understand that. This is very much a work in progress. I'm looking forward to the discussion and hearing what everybody else thinks about this as well. So the first story is the socio-biological one. I've called it Men Do It Because They Can or Just Because They Do. And here's how it goes. It's the early Paleolithic, more than 2 million years ago. One of the earliest men has started to use stone tools, but in other ways is little more than an animal, desperate to mate with a female of his species. He tries it on, she rebuffs his advances, so he rapes her. The first rape, which culminated in a whole system of patriarchy. Fleet of foot and spirited, she would have kicked, bitten, pushed and run, but she could not retaliate in kind. And that's Susan Brown Miller in Against Our Will. And this was the origin story I heard as an undergraduate student in lurid thought experiments by white, Western, radical feminists. There was nobody else on the reading list at the time. The mainstreaming of intersectionality in Western academic feminism and efforts to decolonize the curriculum would come later. These texts taught me that men, in Germaine Greer's words, did not themselves know the depth of their hatred for women. This meant, according to Catherine McKinnon, that any one of us could be raped on the street at any time. And the rationale for this chronic state of imperilment was often either unclear or a biological given. So Brown Miller notoriously argued that rape was a natural consequence of the fact that men's bodies were made to penetrate and women's to be penetrated. As a result of the inescapable construction of their genital organs, she wrote, man was a natural predator and woman his natural prey. You probably all know her famous quote, from prehistoric times to the present, rape has been nothing more or less than a conscious process of intimidation by which all men keep all women in a state of fear. Liz Kelly argued that these functions of rape extended to all forms and threats of sexual violence, which constituted a continuum of power and control. So in Brown Miller's account, rape precedes patriarchy rather than being a product of it. Men came to dominate women because they could rape them, not the other way around. And many fellow feminists have found this origin story unconvincing. As Anne Cahill argues, the fact that men's bodies can penetrate women's does not explain why this is sometimes forcibly done, nor does it explain why some men don't rape or why some women and people of other genders do, including through penetration with alternative body parts or objects, which men may also do. So the rampaging caveman is not a biological inevitability, much though it might seem so from some of the men we know and some of the men who are in high positions in politics today. Not all radical feminist accounts centred on biology, but even those that didn't tended to treat both men's power and men's violence as self-explanatory. So men's violence was a result of men's power, which was a result of men's violence. Joan Scott argues that in accounts such as Catherine McKinnon's, sexual relations were defined as social, but they weren't elaborated as such, with the result that there was nothing except the inherent inequality of the sexual relation itself to explain why the system of power operates as it does. One potential cause of male domination was control of bodies that reproduce. Susan Griffin related this directly to sexual violence through impulses that were psychological as well as mechanistic. So for Griffin, male domination was rooted not just in men's need to own women's reproductive capacities, but in their fear of these capacities and need for equivalent power in or over nature. Lacking the generativity of women, men found their own power in violence and death. She also saw this as an eroticized power, which positioned rape as the perfect combination of sex and violence. Whether they prioritized mind or body, though, these accounts were still based on a single variable of physical difference. They also assumed a stable sexed physicality outside society and culture and took men's desire to control women's fertility for granted. And the idea that in the prehistoric Garden of Eden, men inherently desired sex and women withheld it, men suddenly became jealous of women's generativity, or indeed that there were men and women at all, may be more reflective of modern patriarchy than ancient ways of life. So a second type of origin story is grounded in sexual development, language, and the transition from nature to culture, which is rooted in giving and exchange, particularly the exchange of women. So we're moving now from the socio-biological to the socio-cultural story, origin story for sexual violence. Gail Rubin's theorization of the sex-gender system is based on the relationship between so-called primitive systems of woman exchange and symbolic orders or systems of meaning. Rubin's account was originally written against socialist feminist accounts that reduced women's oppression to a derivative of capitalism, and it melds Freudian psychoanalysis with Levi-Strauss's structural anthropology. I have a joke about Freud here that I would do if we were in person, but I'm not sure I'll land it on Teams, so I think I'll probably leave that one and move on. So Rubin argues that Oedipal development, which creates heterosexual desire, is necessary for kinship systems based on the exchange of women, as it both divides the sexes and it subordinates one to the other. It confers male rights on the boy and forces the girl to accommodate herself to her lesser rights and to being an object of exchange. So in the Oedipal phase, children must renounce the first love object, the mother, for different reasons. The boy must do it not to be castrated by the father, and the girl must renounce her mother in favour of the father, accept her castrated status, and become a sexually passive object of desire. So Freud writes, maleness combines subject, activity, and possession of the penis. Femaleness takes object and passivity. Rubin's essay doesn't discuss rape directly, and feminist psychoanalysis doesn't seem to have engaged fully with sexual violence, but she defines the creation of femininity through Oedipal development as an act of psychic brutality, which, in Jacqueline Rose's words, forces the girl to crunch her sexuality into shape. So for Rose, this is a type of invasion which inscribes violence at the heart of a woman's journey into her sexual destiny. And this is the groundwork and the schema for future acts of sexual violence that aim to mark the woman's body, to destroy any ambiguity on whether in fact she is a woman. So Oedipal development creates gender, and gender is maintained through sexual violence. But as Butler argues, the Oedipal narrative is already gendered because it prescribes conventional masculinity and femininity and normative heterosexual desire as conditions of intelligible existence. The mother is disallowed, Butler notes, because she already belongs to the father, suggesting that the father and the mother exist as logically necessary features of the prohibition itself. Furthermore, to forbid the mother because she already belongs to the father not only assumes these subject positions, but also assumes male ownership of women. But if gender distinctions develop because of Oedipalization, how and why are women already owned? So we might assume, as Levi-Strauss and the radical feminists did, that women are already owned because of their ability to create new life. But there's evidence that a hierarchical gender binary based on reproductive capacity doesn't go back that far. As recently as the early Neolithic, it's thought gender roles were more fluid and heterogeneous and not necessarily the cultural elaboration of biological sex. In other words, generativity doesn't always denote gender, and in an archive that is always already gendered, we rely on modern interpretation to confirm that people who gave birth in the distant past were categorized and grouped as women. There's also evidence that where it was a defining feature, generativity was not always dominated and exploited. So some early Neolithic societies have been described as matrilocal and matrilineal, and although the essentialist romance of goddess worship has been debunked, there's little evidence for systemic gender inequality during the early Neolithic. It's now understood that the mark of biological sex difference wasn't fully made until millennia later during the European Enlightenment. So the classical and medieval one-sex model in which women were inverted and inferior men became an apprehension of two sexes that were fundamentally different, largely to serve the needs of capitalist production. Moreover, colonialism exported binary gender and the nuclear family to control land, production and behaviour within processes of what Heidi Nast terms racist Oedipalization. The unconscious mind, as Nast argues, was first theorised in this context, and the bestial and threatening repressed was encoded as black. In other words, universal and sex difference-based patriarchy is a particular and racially differentiated socio-economic form. Universalist narratives of gender oppression don't fully account for the immense variation in human social organisation throughout history and prehistory, which has always fractured the gender binary with other categories such as class, ethnicity, caste, race, and nation. And because of what Maria Ligonis calls the coloniality of gender, socio-biological and socio-cultural theories can be seen as missionary discourses that naturalise a gendered order that was socially constructed in the modern global north and which only spread in relatively recent history as part of a project of racial domination. This means that origin stories that centre on female vulnerability to the male body or treat women's responsibility for reproduction as a given may in fact be founding themselves on an origin of oppression which, as Wittig might put it, could be only the mark imposed by the oppressor. The view of women as eternally suppressed and always already raped seems less a form of feminism than the triumph of its opposite. Understanding the coloniality of gender means contextualizing it. It means appreciating how gender is shaped by and shapes socioeconomic structures and political projects. And the socioeconomic basis of gender, of course, doesn't begin with capitalism or modern colonialism. Irigaray points out that woman exchange was an economic practice that was accompanied by and stimulated exchanges of other wealth amongst men. For her, this happened alongside the constitution of nature as property and the earliest labour, which was agricultural. And this aligns with Gerda Lerner's account of the creation of patriarchy, which contextualises it in relation to the Neolithic agricultural revolution. Agriculture required group cohesiveness and a steady labour supply, which was what positioned the capacity to reproduce as an economic resource. So for Lerner, this is why relatively egalitarian societies became more structured and hierarchical ones in which women were owned and exchanged. So this is the socio-economic story, the idea that the capacity to produce new life was commodified during more organised economic activity. And it does appear more credible than the attempt to treat the female body as an eternal and unmediated cause of gender oppression. And if a hierarchical gender order was imposed on a social reality that was more complex, this can be seen as conducive to sexual violence. So Lerner argues that the violence underpinning systems of woman exchange was likely sexualized and took the form of forced marriage and rape to produce offspring that women would then be tied to. For Irigaray, it goes much deeper. She writes that the commodification of women's bodies was a process of abstraction in which women came to represent merely the needs and desires of those who consumed them. In other words, they were objectified. And it was this process of abstraction which also allowed women to be accumulated. Man, Irigaray writes, wanted to be able to count off his conquests, seductions, possessions, both sequentially and cumulatively. The possession of a woman, is certainly indispensable to man for the reproductive use value that she represents, but what he desires is to have them all. And that's Irigaray from This Sex Which Is Not One. There's a snag with this one as well, though. So these socio-economic dynamics might not have been as extensive or as linear as Lerner and Irigaray seem to suggest. According to Graeber and Wengrow, the idea of a Neolithic agricultural revolution isn't supported by the available evidence. In the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, which is generally seen as agriculture's birthplace, there was no dramatic switch from Paleolithic forager to Neolithic farmer. In fact, they argue, the transition from living mainly on wild resources to a life based on food production took something in the order of 3,000 years. Furthermore, Graeber and Wengrow's accounts suggest that while the development of agriculture did allow for the possibility of greater inequality, in most cases inequalities began to emerge millennia after its inception and after a long period of experimentation and debate. There's only limited evidence for interpersonal violence and warfare before the late Neolithic. And this is perhaps because women played key or even leadership roles in early farming, a point that's also made by Maria Mies and Angela Saini. It does appear that as the Neolithic period went on, there was emerging gender differentiation and inequality. There's also evidence that the later Neolithic and Copper Ages saw more violent social conditions in general due to competition for resources and changing modes of production. This means that there probably is a relationship between increased economic organisation and violence against women, but we can't necessarily define agriculture as the birthplace of patriarchy in a straightforward way. So for Lerner, agricultural development laid the foundations for archaic states and the creation of patriarchy as a structural system of gender dominance. And the evidence does suggest that Bronze Age state development normally involved the violent subordination of women. In fact, as Angela Saini writes, the Bronze Age was a period in which social categorization in general became more common. Gender inequality intersected with other forms of subordination based on wealth, family, and other factors. Incipient states in Mesopotamia, China, and Greece were deeply stratified societies. Graeber and Wengrow argue that these states often evolved as the result of conflict between administratively organised cities and male-dominated upland groups that were less settled and more warlike. So they see a close relationship between external warfare and internal systems of domination, which aligns with Mies's analysis of the role of war and weapons in women's oppression. For Mies, weapons signify modes of life based on the power of some over others, in which gains can be made through exploitation. Exploitation also requires categories of people. Saini writes that the first clear signs of women being treated categorically different from men appear in Mesopotamia around 5,000 years ago, where administrative tablets show detailed lists of population and assets. In such states, she argues, the capacity to reproduce both workers and soldiers would have definitely been a resource. Laws and religion, she writes, were then built around the gendered principle that there were only two useful kinds of person, women who could bear and raise children and men who could fight. And such states, of course, would have had a category of non-person as well, as they also practiced the super exploitation of slavery. So exploitation requires categories of people. It also requires violence. And the archaeological record shows that in Bronze Age societies defined by both economic exploitation and warfare, the social construction of a form of masculinity associated with violence became more apparent. And this violence was certainly sexual. So by the Iron Age and after, rape was widely used as a weapon of war by the Greek, Roman and other powerful states. In the Iliad, Agamemnon's most senior advisor, Nestor, threatens the Greek soldiers with death if they try to go home before properly conquering Troy, meaning raping Trojan women. Therefore, let none make haste to go till he has first lain with the wife of some Trojan, he cries. Having said all that, state formation is also perhaps more complex than it appears. So as Graeber and Wengrow argue, states also took time and experimentation to evolve, and there was around 6,000 years between the appearance of farming in the Middle East and the rise of what have been called the first states. In many parts of the world, agriculture did not lead to state formation, and centralized power seemed to appear and disappear. Violent patriarchy was by no means inevitable. In ancient Egypt, women could hold a considerable amount of power. The Minoan civilization on Crete is thought to have been both peaceable and women-led. And in the decentralized Maya territory in Mesoamerica, women had a higher status and eventually played a major role in anti-colonial struggles. So what do we make of all of this? First, I need to reiterate that I'm not putting forward an alternative history or an origin story of sexual violence. Some of this historical detail might be wrong. What I want to think about is what these origin stories might tell us about what sexual violence does, and whether we can construct a more dynamic theory of sexual violence from thinking about all of this. So the sociobiological origin story has early humanity existing in a state of nature. Basically. Sorry, I've lost my notes. I feel like that lawyer at the ICJ now. Somebody shuffled my papers. Right, so the sociobiological origin story has early humanity existing in a state of nature characterized by instinctive desires and reactions, in which men's need to dominate women was inherent and driven by one part of their physicality. And this state of nature itself is a colonial motif, emerging during the European Enlightenment in response to indigenous critiques of Western ways of life. It was a defensive move designed to define indigenous people as living in a manner prior to evolution through agriculture into political state formation, to underline the idea that they had no legal claims to the land. As Graeber and Wengrow write, this narrative suppressed and dispossessed societies that had engaged in conscious reflection on social and political forms for millennia, and in which the more recent direction had been explicitly anti-authoritarian. The socio-cultural narrative focused on gendered subjectification through language within heterosexual kinship systems is similarly colonial and elemental. The symbolic order, as the universal structure which carries us into cultural existence, is already gendered and raced. It presupposes both the white heterosexual nuclear family and white men's ownership of women as the stage on which the Oedipal drama plays out. And this deep implication in the capitalist colonial gender binary is perhaps why socio-cultural narratives tend to also collapse into biology, which, as Mies writes, is paraphrased in Freud's statement that anatomy is destiny. Both the socio-biological and socio-cultural origin stories are examples of what Mies terms theories of oppression without exploitation. In other words, they reduce gender domination and sexual violence to a basis that can't be explained without either the idea of inborn male aggression or gender as a pre-giving structuring structure. We might even suggest that both narratives create accounts of oppression that serve to hide exploitation, putting gender domination down to natural and universal tendencies rather than understanding it as a strategy that serves other ends. In fact, there's no raw material that produces violence or that culture can be deployed to fashion. As Butler argues, gender is how natural sex is established as the neutral surface on which gender is allegedly inscribed. Both these stories then tell us the how, but not the why, as they tend to explain gender domination in terms of gender domination. In contrast, the socioeconomic and sociopolitical stories can give us aspects of the why. They can help us answer Mies's question, what conditions are necessary for difference to become hierarchy? In particular, what are the conditions in which the ability to give birth becomes a salient difference, leading to violent attempts to control people who give birth? This requires consideration of when a simple division of tasks and social functions, if it exists, might become a binarized system in which one side of the binary is elevated and appropriates and controls the other. And it does seem likely that the ability to give birth might accrue economic value in more organised modes of production requiring a steady supply of labour. Womanhood then comes into view as a category defined by reproductive work, and this can be understood in much broader terms than simply giving birth. But it also seems clear that the transition to organised agriculture wasn't universal, and this is perhaps a limit to transition accounts as they tend to sketch with a broad brush. Evidence from both prehistory and pre-colonial societies in the global south also suggests that reproductive capacities can be venerated and respected, as well as appropriated and controlled. So differences between bodies aren't always interpreted and valued in the same way. There's also no reason to believe that people with generative capacities didn't exercise agency over these in the distant past. Mies argues that women in pre-patriarchal societies perhaps knew better than modern women how to regulate their own fertility, often through their plant-based knowledge. It's also thought that this botanical knowledge and associated skills in textiles and mathematics was valued in early agriculture and nascent cities. In agricultural societies and nascent cities where women did have some influence and power, the formation of states could have been the site of a political backlash. This is supported by the fact that state development normally did involve the violent subordination of women. The connections between masculinity and warfare, which remain apparent today, are a key piece of this puzzle, as are the economic needs of large and organised communities of people. It also seems clear that warlike societies based on physical and military might are ideal sites for the domination of some groups over others. In such a society, any physical difference might become a vulnerability and a means of categorization in the service of power. And rather than being a natural situation, this is a political one, with nature deployed to justify such arrangements rather than being their cause. All this suggests that instead of a theory of gender domination, we need an account of gendered dominations, which may have been emergent at particular times and places and may have materialized and subsided depending on the social, economic and political conditions. So there's not one single origin, but many. And what matters is not whether any origin story is literally true, but how it can help us understand what sexual violence does. It seems clear that sexual violence is not an expression of man's natural or culturally instilled aggressiveness and desire to control women, but is an ongoing strategy that facilitates domination in the service of other ends. So to finish up, I want to propose 5 hypotheses. And the first 3 come from the preceding discussion. So number 1, reproductive bodies are the substrate for organised economic activity. Reproductive capacity, number 2, is therefore the source of and a potential and perennial limit to accumulation if it is not owned and controlled. And number 3, as a result, reproductive bodies, often defined as female, but perhaps not always, have been marked off as territory for men's use. Marking something off as one's own territory is an act of enclosure. The root of this word is the Middle English enclosen or inclosen, meaning to surround or confine in a space such as a cloister, or to cordon off an area for one's own use. And we can see that at various points in the past and into the present, women have been marked off for men's use, which has also sometimes meant confining them to suppress their influence and power. The second 2 hypotheses are related to thinking about the role of sexual violence in this enclosure, and I'm going to cover these 2 in the last part of this discussion. So number 4, sexual violence is a performative enlargement of one's territory at the expense of another's. But number 5, enclosure must be continual as territory can never be fully taken. So traditional theories of patriarchy understand women as objectified in the service of male control, which tends to be treated as an uncaused cause, if not as biologically given. Objectification has been heavily critiqued within feminist theory, and I don't need to rehearse these critiques here except to say that the idea of objectification is a very blunt instrument. So as was apparent in the first part of this talk, the understandings of power here are simplistic, binary, static, deterministic, and strangely ahistorical, even when set up as historical thought experiments. If we set sexual violence in the context of modes of production and political formations over time, objectification is not that useful as an idea. An alternative theory I found useful is Anne Cahill's notion of derivatization, which means one person being made a derivative of another's desires, wishes, or projects. For Cahill, derivatization works at an individual level as we assess potential partners against our own requirements, and on societal levels as standards of femininity are oriented around what we understand as male desire. In acts of sexual violence, she writes, the victim is turned into a derivative of the will of the assailant and forced to be what the assailant wants. So derivatization for Cahill is an alternative to theories of objectification, which understand women as things. Because to be made a derivative of another's desires is to be forced into a shape that you weren't in before. So this reduction of difference to sameness crucially requires a subject to be imposed upon. And without this subject, she argues, sexual violence would neither be necessary nor very appealing. This is also taken up by Renee Heberle, who draws on Scarry's work on hypotheses that I want to talk about are related to the role, thinking about the role of sexual violence in the enclosure of women. And I'm going to cover these kind of going forward to the end of the talk now. So number 4, sexual violence is a performative enlargement of one's territory at the expense of another's. But number 5, enclosure must be continual as territory can never be fully taken. So traditional theories of patriarchy understand women as objectified in the service of male control, which tends to be treated as an uncaused cause, if not as biologically given. The idea of objectification has been heavily critiqued within feminist theory, so I don't need to rehearse those critiques except to say that it's quite a blunt instrument. And as I talked through in the first part of the lecture, the understandings of power here are quite simplistic: binary, static, deterministic, and strangely ahistorical, even when they're set up as historical thought experiments. So if we set sexual violence in the context of modes of production and political formations over time, objectification is not that useful as an idea. An alternative theory I've found useful is Anne Cahill's notion of derivatization, which means one person being made a derivative of another's desires, wishes, or projects. For Cahill, derivatization works at an individual level as we assess potential partners against our own requirements, and on societal levels as standards of femininity are oriented around what we understand as male desire. In acts of sexual assault, the victim is turned into a derivative of the will of the assailant and forced to be what the assailant wants. Derivatization for Cahill is an alternative to theories of objectification, which understand women as things, because to be made a derivative of another's desires is to be forced into a shape that you weren't in before. This reduction of difference to sameness crucially requires a subject to be imposed on. Without this subject, she argues, violence would be neither necessary nor very appealing. And this is also taken up by Renee Heberly, who draws on Scarry's work on torture to think about how perpetrators reduce their victims' space and enlarge their own, physically and psychically, through the infliction of pain. For Scarry, the victim's torment doesn't just reflect but enacts the supremacy of the perpetrator. And in the case of sexual violence, Heberly suggests the reality of women's pain may also translate into the reality of male power. Jacqueline Rose similarly describes sexual violence as the great male performative, through which a man manifests not only that he is the one with the power, but also that his power and his sexuality are one and the same thing. So this suggests a few things: that sexual violence is performative, that there's a spatial or territorial dimension to it, and that male power isn't a given in either a biological or a cultural sense. Heberly reminds us that sexual and domestic violence often escalate when a woman tries to leave. This suggests a masculinity that's insecure and trying to reassert control. And at macro levels, sexual violence may also be an acting out of failure, signifying the limits rather than the ascendancy of patriarchy. If there were no limits, as Heberly writes, patriarchy would not have had to constantly reinvent itself and reconstitute its legitimacy in the face of threats from actual historical women. Conceptualizing sexual violence in this way helps to understand its role in shifting relations of gendered domination through time. It also requires an understanding of bodies as territory to be conquered and worked. Butler's theorization of the body as a set of boundaries rather than an abiding biological substance or a ready surface awaiting resignification through culture is helpful here. For Butler, subjectification establishes the effect of a structuring in a space and creates areas of permeability and impermeability, which in patriarchal societies have been both gendered and heterosexed. In this context, sexual violence can be seen as a forced process of feminization through invasion within a strategy of enlargement that's identified as masculine. It works to establish or re-establish male authority and to reiterate and reify binary gender and heterosexuality. And sexual violence is also perpetrated to punish or correct queer or gender non-conforming people. This echoes the idea of sexual violence as invasion contained in both the socio-biological and socio-cultural accounts, but without presupposing a sexed subject and without situating this invasion as inevitable in either biology or culture. In fact, it's arguable that the very idea of invasion presupposes a territory to be assailed that's not yet already owned. It's also a way of not putting the invasion of women's bodies down to inherent male aggression. You invade a territory to enclose it, not just for the sake of invading it. Sexual violence then is a way of enclosing women who are not always already subjugated by biology or by the entry into culture. This isn't a simple model of dominance and submission, but one of conflict and manoeuvre. Oedipal understandings of sexual violence often position it as an instinctive and defensive reaction against engulfment by the feminine as mother. The notion of sexual violence as a strategy of enclosure points towards more deliberate and aggressive motives of enlarging one's territory at another's expense, no matter the gender of rapist or raped. The view of sexual violence as a strategy of enclosure can perhaps also be used to understand self-enclosure within the bounds of femininity as protection from violence, a shutting away of self, a reduction of one's own territory, physically and intellectually, that it is hoped will shield one from attack. But this enclosure must be continual, and this is because women are not objects, as Cahill says. When talking about land, enclosure signifies the separation of the producer from their means of production. But women can never be completely alienated from our bodies, which means that we present a perennial limit to accumulation unless we're kept in check by violence. And I think conceptualizing it in this way, as a continual process of enclosure within the continual process that is patriarchy, helps us to make sense of persistent sexual violence without defaulting to inherent male aggression or to a battle of the sexes that tends to be explained in terms of itself. Travelling forward in time, the orgy of violence against women in the early modern witch hunts, which set the stage for capitalism as well as modern Western misogyny, would then be a moment of re-enclosure of women alongside the enclosure of the land. Federici defines the early modern witch hunts as a form of primitive accumulation, but it seems clear that this took place on a stage set by earlier enclosures of women's bodies facilitated by sexual violence. This is what both Irigere and Mies mean when they say that patriarchy was the blueprint for capitalism, and the idea of enclosure helps to conceptualize how and why this was the case. It also gives us a theory of patriarchy that doesn't reduce everything to gender and explain gender inequality in terms of itself. So I hope that this more expansive notion of enclosure might help us to better understand a range of things, from why economic exploitation and sexual exploitation so often go hand in hand, to why women are sexually harassed in public space, to why domestic violence is key to extracting free social reproduction, to why sexual violence is so often part of the anti-feminist backlash. But I'd like to hear what you think. And as I said, this is a work in progress. So I'll stop there for the second time and hope that you all heard this last bit of the talk this time. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alison. We did. Thank you for navigating the inevitable kind of technological issues so well, and coming back and being able to jump straight back in. And thank you to everyone online who for your patience in us getting back, Alison.
Thank you for coming back.
So we have around half an hour or so for kind of questions, discussions, reflections, and